All right. Jumping into the COP. So excited to present the 2025 COP. We're in an exciting and transformative time for the utility. What we'll plan to do, the goal for today is to go through a quick overview on the development of the plan, key assumptions that drive the plan, and then ultimately the financial outcomes and rate impacts. We'll be looking for hopefully a board action in the December board meeting. Let's move on to the next slide. As we think about it, I think it's important that we understand the process that we go through to get us here. It's not a it's not a fast process. This takes a lot of time and effort across the entire enterprise. We started in the April timeframe, literally 8 months ago, working on load forecast. And again, that's the critical drivers we think about our plan. Wholesale marketing, figuring out what's going to happen relative to gas, power prices, how we're going to balance the system out. Very complex and volatile. And then we get into the monthly detailed budgets in the May through July timeframe. We have our resource optimization sessions where we go through and meet in detail, going through each of the detailed budgets that the business units submit. We also go through a resource planning council session where we've got a team that's cross-functional, spends well over 48 hours reviewing our capital budgets. The reason I bring that up, it's important to understand the process. We had a lot of big decisions in front of us this year as we looked at specifically what was coming our way. We're a growing utility. As we look across the different asks that come from the organization, a lot of big asks, right? What do you need to do your business? And so we had to make some very difficult decisions, and you're going to see that come forward in terms of what we've put forward in the budget. As we talk about the initial asks and what some of the reductions were, we had a $1.1 billion capital budget. We reduced that by $350 million. As it relates to headcount, we originally had 150 additional positions being added. That's very similar to what we had last year. We reduced that down by 88 positions. And then as it relates to some of our more specific capital projects, some of the enterprise priorities, those we had to assess, looking at the resources we had available, but ultimately made the decisions from a prioritization perspective to defer some of those investments. The West Service Center, Training Center, our wholesale energy risk management system, EPM, and some of our fleet purchases. So just to highlight some of the decisions that were made as we went through this process. That leads us to where we're at today. I do want to highlight the fact that we have, in October, we went through a 5-year forecast with the Finance Committee. We're meeting today to talk about the preliminary COP, and then again, we'll look to get the formal, the COP approved in December by the board. I do want to thank everyone across the utility for all their efforts. Again, that's a huge effort for the past 8 months to get us to this point, and it involves everyone. So thank you very much for that.
Sorry, briefly, you mentioned looking forward, the headcount number, and I have the same question that we had in the pre-committee there. You mentioned 150 and a decrease to 88. That is a lower increase in additional headcounts. That is not a decrease in current headcount.
That is correct. So we added a total of 62 positions.
Okay.
Last was for one.
Just want to make sure that we're not kind of casually glancing over the idea that we're decreasing headcount or anything like that. And yeah, it's a lower increase.
Lower increase, thank you. Yeah, and again, just asking the organization, what can we get done with what headcount we have today, recognizing that those are major decisions for the utility to move forward.
Is that a relatively temporary hold back on hiring, or is that just a long-term thing?
No, I think as we continue to move through, a lot of it was if you have open positions, make sure those are getting filled. Really trying to focus folks in on what's the key work that needs to get done. Is there other things that can be reprioritized? Again, recognizing that we don't have infinite resources, but really looking at folks to reprioritize work.
I would say, Mike, there was a very robust conversation around the table with all the vice presidents on these. And I would say the vast majority of the positions that were requested are still needed. It's a matter of how much can we absorb in one go. We've been adding a lot of people in the past couple of years. There's a lot of training and turnover that we need to process throughout the organization. There were a handful, there were a few positions where with talking with the VPs, we realized actually, you know what, that seems redundant, or maybe we can find a different way of doing that same work with fewer resources. So a few of them, through good conversation and prioritization, we realized we don't need those going forward. I would say the vast majority of them we will need. It's just a matter of timing. How do we spread these out over the next few years in a way that helps our teams train others, but also doesn't put too much rate pressure all in one year, and we can actually spread this out over.
Maybe I missed a part two, but any growth in the working employees, is that related to the new gas plants?
Growth in employees is related to growth in the district, I would say. So yes, the new generation, we're adding 11 new turbines to the 16 we currently have. So there's always the need for more maintenance, operations of those units. I think the one thing that is overlooked sometimes is we continue to add miles and miles and miles of distribution lines, street lights, underground. That needs more people. So I would say in the past few years, we've focused a lot of our augmentation people on technology services, looking at Kate and others. This year, I would say for the past 3 years, there's been a big emphasis on operations, utility operations. So that has been the bulk of our employee augmentation is on operations, distribution, generation. Troy?
Craft, engineering.
Engineering.
Yes, we've hired a lot of engineers last year, this year, hire more next year. But you can only bring on so many at a time, having them spread out and kind of work through your training processes are really important. Steam fitters, electricians, we're adding some substation folks next year. So a good balance, at least in my group, between those who are out in the field or in the plants doing the work and those who engineer and plan the works. At all.
The interesting data point on that is 80% were between TS and utility operations, with the majority being utility operations for contacts. I think we'll keep us going on the next slide. So here we've got strategic directive 2, which is rates that's put forth by the board, again, having us maintain reasonable rates. We've got 7 different items here that are called out. I want to touch base on 3 specifically. Again, we look to deliver on all of these. Equitably assigned costs across and within customer classes. This is a really important piece as we think about how we apply cost of service. And we're going to talk about that here in a moment, that's an important piece as we continue to look at our growing utility. Pursue rates that are directional and reflect the cost of energy when used. We only incur our costs. We're not building up reserves. We only ask for rates when they're needed. And so that's an important piece. We want to make sure we're keeping money in our customers' pockets and also out in the community. And lastly, the last one is pursue a directional rate target that's 10% below the North Central average. This has been put forth by the board. We're very proud of the fact that if we look at our 2023 EIA data, we're 15.8% below the regional average. As we think about that on a national average, we're at 27.4%. Again, that's using the 2023 data. We've just got the 24 data, which came out recently. And again, we're 32.5% below the national average. So if we think about what that means in terms of keeping dollars in our customers' pockets, if we were to adjust to the national rate, that would be roughly $400 million. So we're very proud of the fact that we've continued to invest in the utility, grow the utility, but continue to become more competitive on the national scale. Go to the next slide. As we think about critical assumptions, obviously we focus on our mission to provide affordable, reliable, and environmentally sensitive power. I'd really highlight the importance of that as it relates to 2024 and as we look at 2025. We're going to spend some time talking about the challenges we had in 2024, storms, different events that came our way, really challenged our reliability. As we think about our focus for 2025 as well, making sure that we're investing and ensuring better resiliency and reliability over the course of time, and also making sure that we're balancing that with affordability. We wanted to make sure too that we're also aligning and hitting the vision of Power of the Future 2050. And then also as we think about it, making sure that when we get down to the tactical level that we've got our core business that's focused on. So again, making sure that we're keeping the lights on, maintaining our assets and ensuring compliance. And lastly, we've utilized our enterprise priorities for the next 5 years as key focuses for the utility as we move forward. We've got four there, resource adequacy. Again, as we think about that, ensuring that we've got reliability and resiliency, technology transformation, key to making sure that we've got a strong technology backbone. Next generation grid, our AMI program, making sure that we've got the right tools for the new customer experience and available for our employees, reduce our outage times. And then last, our master facilities plan focused on making sure we've got the proper facilities for our customers and for our employees. We move on to the next slide. Here we've got our strategic directives. These are front and center as we look at when we do our planning efforts. Each of the VPs is assigned a strategic directive, and their goal is to make sure that we're maintaining, delivering on the expectations for the strategic directive. And in some cases, we have to maintain a balance, making sure that if they may push or pull one another, that we're contemplating those appropriately. But these are really the pillars of our planning process. And we do have a good track record of delivering on these. As we focus for 2025 and during the planning year, one was, we went through and experienced the series of storms. So as we thought about Winter Storm Jerry, the loss of generation, wind, tornadoes, floods, making sure that we've invested in the future to hopefully address those issues. And again, that's really focused in on SD4 around reliability and resiliency. Access to credit markets, SD3. We just got back from our meeting with rating agencies in New York, providing them with a 5-year outlook. Director Spurgeon, thank you for going with us and representing the board. We were very fortunate 2 weeks ago, we received the AA rating back from the agencies, stable outlook, which we're proud of, both from Moody's and S&P. And then we completed our pricing just this last week and got very competitive rates. So we'll look at that as a success. Again, a good outcome for our customers. We also focus on customer satisfaction, SD5. We've continued to improve in that area, which we're proud of. And then also a real focus on SD7, our environmental stewardship. As we move on to the next slide. Here's the executive summary talk. We mentioned this earlier in today's presentation where we're talking about how we've grown as a utility. The request that we're making is for a budget of $2.3 billion. We've got that broken out here in terms of the various cost categories. Some important items to highlight when we look at that rate increase so that it results in 6.3%. We want to make sure that as we go through, that's composed of the general rate increase of 4.9%. And then as we've talked about costs that we incurred in 2024 that will be replenished in 25, that's a 1.4% increase broken between the fuel and purchase power adjustment and the rate stabilization account. And again, as we'll walk through each of these cost categories in detail as we get into the presentation. Let's move on to the next slide. One of the items, again, as we think about that impact, it's important to think about what happened in 2024 and what we've attempted to capture here is roughly 1/4 of the rate increases associated with costs incurred in 2024. You'll remember that we've had milder weather, we've had storms, 6 major events: Winter Storm Jerry, the April tornadoes, May storms, June flood, and storms as well as the July historic storm that we'd never seen before. On the retail side, again, we've continued to have milder weather. We've all experienced that ourselves. But what did that mean relative to on the retail revenue side? We've seen roughly $18 million in reduced residential and commercial revenues as a result of the milder weather. Fortunately, we've had some offsets with industrial. But again, as we think about hitting our 2x debt coverage, which is put out in SD3, excuse me, this is the important part in the fact that to hit that, we're going to need to get a replenishment of a total of $18.1 million. 0.4% of that will be through the FPPA under collection. Again, that's driven by Winter Storm Jerry, unplanned outages, and partial offsets with increased off-system sales, which Laura covered a moment ago. The other items are really additional costs that we incurred that we didn't anticipate. We've got Winter Storm Jerry. These are additional costs for payroll and materials, $1.6 million. As we think about the fact that we had the increase in terms of our storm costs. 6.5 of that is really associated with both the amount that's not going to be recovered by FEMA and also additional cable locating. We've talked about that. That's a regulatory requirement that we're required to do. We've seen a higher incurrence of that as a result of our continued growth. And then, as I talked about on the retail revenue side, we're coming in less than anticipated in terms of milder weather. And so if we think about those collectively, that's roughly 1.4 of the increase that's being requested for 2025. What I do want to highlight, though, is all the work that's gone on behind the scenes to reduce this as much as possible. So as we think about the Winter Storm Jerry cost, $36 million. As we think about some of the production challenges that we've had with our units, that's roughly $30 million of lost opportunity. And then the storm costs, again, were $39 million. We're getting $33 million of that back from FEMA. We're very thankful for that. I'd also highlight that management's gone out to reduce costs as well, reducing our costs by $9.4 million through delaying traveling, delaying the hiring of positions till the end of the year. Again, and doing anything we could to really reduce the impact that has on our customers, knowing that this is a very serious decision and impacts our customers.
If I can check quickly on the rate stabilization account, really important for us to remember that the way this works for OPPD is it's on an annual basis. There are some other utilities who have monthly rate riders or adjustment clauses in their monthly bills. So if we had been one of those utilities, as these additional expenses occur, you would see an increase or a decrease of rates the following month. You catch up every month or every quarter. Some utilities do this on a quarterly basis. We don't. But so the rate stabilization helped us stabilize rates for customers throughout all of 2024. We don't adjust rates throughout 2024. We use these funds we have saved to cover those deficits. And then eventually we'll have to replenish that fund so that we have additional funds to continue to do this in the future. It sounds obvious, but I think it's important to remind the public that that's really how the rate stabilization works. And that's the stability we enjoyed through 2024 as these expenses happen.
We'll say out here. Yeah. Costs borne in 24 will collect in 25. Again, seen as to the benefit of our customers to have that mechanism in place. Any questions on this? This is an important slide as we think about the rate increase. I'll keep us moving. So let's move on to the next slide. Again, as we think about the remaining balance of the general rate increase across all customers, 4.9%. Really, this is the investment to support our mission moving forward as we think about sustaining our existing assets, making sure that we're continuing to address aging infrastructure as well as our grid, focusing on reliability and weather investment so we, again, can address issues such as we had with Winter Storm Jerry. We're continuing to invest heavily in the AMI system. So we've got updating the outage management system, field management system, as well as customer platform, increasing in vegetation management, increasing 71% in the proposed budget. So going from 15 million to 29 million, $12 million increase is what's been proposed, again, to make sure that we're staying on top of our vegetation management and continue to enhance the program we've got today. And then as it relates to expand and transform, again, continuing to address additional planning reserve margin requirements and load growth. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And then also T&D investments to make sure we've got a reliable system for our customers. And really, those are the underpinnings of what gets us to the 4.9% increase from the customer perspective.
Hey, Jeff, it's kind of unusual that the rate increases across the board equally. Is that an indication that the residential, commercial, industrial are all somewhat aligned already as far as proximity to power or whatever?
Yeah, we'll get to that later in the presentation, explain how that gets allocated across the different customers differently from a cost of service perspective.
Okay.
So get there in just a moment. Good question. Let's move on to the next slide. So a couple items that are important as we're looking at what's causing our need for additional investment. Planning reserve margin. As you know, we've heard quite a bit about this. We're a member of SPP, ensuring that we have reserve margins to insert. They ensure that we have reserve margins to ensure reliable demand and service. So what does this mean for us as we think about our generation capacity to meet our peak load? We have to add, that's the flat line. If you go up to the dotted line, that's the amount that planning reserve margin is required by SPP. And so again, as we really think about PRM, that's the area between the solid line and the dotted line. And as we think about that, it's important. PRM is currently at 15% both for winter and summer. It's grown from 12. SPP has approved a 16% increase in PRM. For summer, 36% for winter, and that's going to be effective in 2026. And so as we think about that on our existing level of generation, and the fact that our winter peak, if you're doing quick math, 2,200 megawatts peak load, if we go from up by 21% from 15 to 36, that gets you almost 500 megawatts just associated with planning reserve margin. That's effectively the size of Turtle Creek. And so it's an important piece as we think about why we're adding the additional generation, some of the requirements that are out there for us as we continue to grow as a utility, but also have additional regulatory requirements moving forward.
So let me double down on that. So it's adding additional generation resources to serve the same load. And that's an important concept because we often get the questions, hey, are the new customers paying their fair share? And the answer is yes, they are. And also for the rest of us, weather conditions, asset conditions have made it harder for us to serve the same load. So for the same of us, for the rest of us in the district, we are required to have a lot more machines spinning, a lot more wires to serve the same load. And it's a hard concept to share because, you know, as a customer owner, you're really not experiencing any additional service. But what we're trying to do here is reduce the risk and the probability of outages by having more spinning reserves. And that's that planned reserve margin that applies to all of our load.
Thank you. All right, we'll continue on. We talked about this earlier today, progress against new generation goals. Again, something really to be proud of. You'll remember, obviously, back in August of last year, the board approved a resolution to secure 2 to 2.5 gigawatt hours of additional generation. Team's done a great job. To date, we've got 2.2 gigawatts contract in the last 14 months. Frankly, unbelievable to get that amount of work completed. That's 88% of what's needed. Again, earlier than anticipated too. We originally had that forecasted by 2032, brought that in by 2029. So a great outcome from that perspective. And I think relative to what that provides us, we've heard about this, reduced risk relative to supply chain as well as price. So we're thankful for that. That does not include the 700 megawatts for Turtle Creek, Stainbear Lake, and Platteview. But I do want to also highlight separately for 2024, as we think about it, we've got 1,600 megawatts coming on between High Banks, Milligan, Platteview, Turtle Creek, and Stainbear Lake. So again, just some great outcomes in terms of delivering on what was requested by the board. So hats off to the teams for doing that. And again, as we think about the impacts for resilience and reliability, those pieces are key. I also wanted to touch base for one moment on, let's go to the next slide, where we're at relative to emissions. You're well aware of where we're at. This is a good news story. We continue to increase our load and a need for megawatt hours, yet we're decreasing over time our carbon intensity and direct emissions. This is a projection through 2032. How do we get there? 90% of what we're adding in terms of near-term generation is going to be in the form of carbon-free with renewables. So again, as we think about what's getting us there as well, we talked about some of the projects that are coming online. I won't spend more time talking about that. You guys are familiar with this slide, but it's an important piece that underpins what's baked within our COP. Next slide. So again, as we think about the rate increase drivers, again, we talked about the 2024 cost recovery, 1.4%. As we look on beyond 2024 and really look at 25, what are we investing in? 4.9 of the increase is associated with folks coming from our capital O&M investment. Again, focusing in on our additional sustainability associated with our existing units, plus a good portion associated with continuing to expand our enterprise priorities on the capital side. Relative to our operations and maintenance costs, again, we do see those increasing because of headcount. We talked about that. I mentioned the investment in additional vegetation management, what that means for the organization. And then as we think about the additional enterprise priorities we've got relative to AMI, that'll continue to be invested in. And then relative to planning reserve margin requirements, continue to invest and make sure that we're adding additional PPAs and continue to bring on the capacity that's needed so we can be compliant.
I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later on, but just give a little bit of a preview, at least from my seat leading the organization. It's been a journey, right? And working with customers on increasing reliability. We've had our fair share, 6 major storms this year, and it's been very evident the importance of keeping the lights on and having a really good reliability, really good resilience, and all the systems that support that. When I became CEO, if you all remember, I remember very clearly, we had that big major storm in 2021. At the time, was the largest storm on record. And one of the decisions I made back then was we need to have a much more modern communication system with our customers. That led us to invest in our advanced metering infrastructure ecosystem, the suite of different systems, programs, et cetera, that we need to modernize at OPPD so that we can talk to our customers back and forth via modern meters. That we'll hear about these later on. There's a briefing later today, but that is clearly helping us with estimated times of restoration, with communicating with customers when power goes out, the type of outage that our customers are experiencing, the voltage that was last seen at the meter. It will help us get to the restoration a lot faster. Those are investments that are now, we're starting to pay for those. A question that I often get asked is, well, why did you do that? Why are you replacing meters? Well, these also happened at the same time as we had to replace old meters, right? It's those meters that we have today, a lot of them are 15 to 20-year life. They're ready to be replaced. We're replacing them with modern, much better functionality. Just coming up here, and Aaron, I'm going to steal your thunder a little bit. Next year, for example, part of these investments, you will see our customers will experience a brand new outage map. Right? Come to the summer season, we'll have, and this is part of those investments that customers will start experiencing the tangible results of these investments. We'll start installing new meters next year. It'll take us a few years, but that's going to open up a lot of capability and functionality for customers. Vegetation management. Last year, actually this year, and I was very proud of these when I went out on press conferences with the mayor. We were talking about the huge increases we've made on vegetation management to try to reduce the cycle of tree trimming. Right? The ideal cycle of 5 years. Right now, we're not at 5 years. We're at over 7 years. We need to expedite and facilitate the tree trimming so that no tree gets trimmed longer than every 5 years. Right now, we're not there. This year's budget was $17 million. We're proposing to increase that to $29 million. Significant increase. Why? One, because it's inflation, things cost a lot more, but what we're seeing is climate has changed on us, and trees are growing a lot faster than they were growing before, and we're certainly not keeping up with the tree trimming that we need so that we can deliver customers that reliability.
Have we given any additional thought to having the tree trimming done in-house?
Oh,
with the staff.
With our staff, we've actually thought about that. So the reason why we contract those services out today has to do with efficiency. A lot of times we can flex. Not every season, not every month in the state of Nebraska is a growing season. So some our vendors have the flexibility to send tree trimmers out of state and go to different regions where they can trim at different times of the year that they can trim with us. The other one is the investment we would have to make on equipment and space to store that equipment. It's a much longer lead time for us. I'm not suggesting that may not be in the cards for us in the future, but for now, in order for us to expedite the tree trimming, we made the decision to continue with the same model of contracting those services out and augmenting to have more people, more trucks, doing more routes to.
These are large vendors too. And if you think about these massive storms that we've had, they've sent hundreds of people to Omaha to help, cut the trees that have fallen during these storms. So there's a benefit to having regional partners like that when you have these major events, and they've shown up really well in that space.
And maybe I'm oversimplifying, I guess, but I realize you could still have these arrangements, even if we had at least some of it done in-house.
I would characterize right now at all of our centers, which is where you have trucks and equipment and things of that nature, we don't have excess room.
Excess what, I'm sorry?
Room.
Okay.
So we would have to build facilities, you'd have to buy trucks, because the trucks we have now are fully utilized.
Well, it'd be a long-term commitment, obviously, but it's a huge cost. Just wanna throw it out there. Fine.
Right. I'm going to jump us into some more of the details on the financials. We'll go forward 2 slides if that's okay. So here's the details of the operating plan. So as it relates to retail revenues, this is excluding wholesale revenues. You can see a 5-year trajectory here. Again, a continued healthy growth over the course of time. As we think about that, again, residential continues to be the anchor of the utility with commercial and lastly industrial coming in behind that. As we look at 2025, again, we see a notable increase, 214 million. 2025, we see an increase of 214 million. 2024 projected slightly below budget. Again, that was associated with the weather impacts that we saw and are experiencing in 2024. I would highlight a couple of different things as we look at this. Again, this incorporates growth plus the rate increase. Again, really to cover the costs associated with the investments in our people, program, and assets. I will also just highlight as we continue to look more broadly across the district, you see growth all over the territory. Apartments, homes, commercials continue to grow. Projection for new customers of 6,000 meters. So that's almost 12,000 to 15,000 from a population perspective. So again, a large amount of growth in the area. And I also highlight last year, as it relates to Douglas County, was the fastest growing county by GDP in the U.S. That's pretty amazing. And I think we're seeing that here. To keep us moving forward as it relates to the power cost side of our business, again,
And by the way, it was GDP percentage, not GDP total. Still.
Yep.
Fastest, there was no other county in the United States grew faster percentage-wise GDP than Douglas County.
As we think about again, the cost to balance out our system to provide power to our customers, we look at both the wholesale revenues with an offset by fuel and purchase power. What you do see here is the impact of the polar vortex. So you can see market prices quite high in 2021, elevated prices in 22, and we've come back down to more moderated prices, 23 and beyond. As we look at this again, relative to net power costs, we see those going up by 48 million as we net those together, or 14.6 over the 24 budget. Purchase power, which you're going to see is in the blue, again, increasing by 67.2 million or 21.5%. A good portion of that as it relates to 261 customers. So you'll remember they buy at the wholesale price of power. 54 million of that is associated with our 261M customers, with 13 million being associated with growth from all other customers. Fuel expense.
Can you briefly explain what that means? Those costs and revenues from 261M customers, the large voltage transmission customers. It's an important one that I would like to emphasize.
Yeah, I know it's important. So, as we looked at this, trying to make sure we're understanding all the drivers of that, we spent a lot of time looking at the load forecast specifically across all customer classes as well as 261. They purchased at the wholesale price of power. So as it relates to what we purchase for them, that comes through at a market price. And again, as we talk about the increase, The majority of that is associated with those customers. We also then collect that on the other side in terms of, on the wholesale side, we charge, or sorry, on the retail side, we charge them the wholesale price as well. They cover that. And so it's an important netting that goes on when you think about what's being reflected both on the last slide as it relates to retail sales and the growth in industrials, and then also what we're reflecting here as well.
So it is a pass through. Those customers take on additional risk. There have been years when they have been upside down on their additional cost. Some years they make some profit. We just pass that through. And I think it's important in terms of a fair allocation of resources to highlight that particular rate does exactly what it was designed to do, which is mitigate that risk for the rest of our customers and really put that back on those very large users.
Thank you.
Jeff, the purchase power, it's high this year primarily because of extended outages.
We have seen that from extended outages and then just higher costs during Winter Storm Jerry.
Yeah. And then going forward, looking into 25, how much are outages playing into that number versus increase to meet retail load growth and planning reserve requirements?
I don't have that breakout. Again, what I do have is I know the increase is 67 million, with the 54 of that being for 261M, so relatively small portion left over. So 14 million to accommodate all of those pieces that you're talking about.
All right.
Between plan reserve margin growth.
Thank you.
Relative to fuel expense, again, we continue to see that increase. You'd anticipate that. We've got a full year of operations anticipated for Turtle Creek and Standing Bear Lake, with those being online for the entire year. And then relative.
Did we use a lot more fuel in 2021? Why is that bar so high? Oh, sorry. I was looking at wholesale revenues, but anyway, the point I was trying to make, when you look at fuel and purchase power, the fuel piece was higher in 2021, not because we used more fuel, but that was the Winter Storm Uri effect. Just highlighting the same volume, it's just those anomalies.
We've seen prices have come down over the course of time. And then wholesale revenues, again, a large portion of this relates to, when we see the increase is related to our congestion hedging revenues. We've talked about how those have impacted our results. We're $55 million up year to date in 2024. Again, that's a more difficult piece to try to budget, but we've gone back and looked at a multi-year average to do a better job of determining what that will be. And that's the largest driver of the change in our wholesale revenues. Let's move on to the next slide. Here we see O&M. I'll highlight relative to 2024. You'll see that again, we were above budget with the 2024 projected. Again, we continue to see increased cable locating. We talked about that. We've included that now in the budget, additional dollars, because we're just simply seeing that as a result of our growth. And then we've also got the unbudgeted storm costs, which weren't covered by FEMA, included in there. And that, again, that's what's driving up us above the budget in 2024 when you look at the projection. As we look at 2025, specifically, we're seeing an increase of $54 million or 10% above what we had in the budget for 2024. A number of drivers there: inflation, increased headcount to support our continued growth from a generation perspective, and also our enterprise priorities. And then also we talked about increased vegetation management. Those are the drivers that are increasing the costs in 2025. As we specifically look at some of the more detailed drivers by category. So for T&D, main drivers there, again, headcount growth to serve the growing utility. Again, we talked about tree trimming, that would be in the T&D area. As we look at production, that grows as well. We can see that specifically we're adding effectively additional expenses associated with the full year of operations for both Turtle Creek and Standing Bear Lake being online. So both headcount as well as other operating costs. And A&G shows an increase as well. And again, that's associated with supporting additional headcount and benefit costs, again, as we continue to grow as a utility. If there's no questions, I'm going to move us on to capital. We've been using this format for a number of years now. We really like it because it highlights where's our dollars being invested. Are we sustaining the existing assets we have? And then what amount of our capital portfolio is going to support in the future? Here you can see the 25% again is associated with sustaining our assets. As we look at that we typically done a comparison to historical depreciation. Our depreciation rate right now is about roughly 115 million. So we are seeing a higher level of reinvestment in terms of sustaining our assets. I will highlight that we've got aging assets, and so we continue to see a need to invest additional dollars. And Troy's talked quite a bit about that over the course of time. As we look at the overall capital budget, we can see that we continue to expand dollars, and that's roughly focused on $15 million increase above 24. That's associated with load growth and economic development. There you're seeing additional investment in terms of our substations, transformers. That's $23 million. Residential continues to be a heavy amount of investment, $16 million. That's installing both underground as well as overhead electric facilities. Again, as we continue to grow, seeing more investment there. T&D streetlights, $10 million. So again, making sure that we're continuing to focus on load growth and economic development for areas that we've already got in place. And then relative to our enterprise priorities, that's the largest portion at 60.2 million. Again, investment in the 4 new combustion turbines is the largest portion of that, AMI, and then our integrated operations center in 2025. So substantial amount of investment in those strategic priorities. Move on to the next slide. We've got it broken out by category. Again, production growing from 261 million to 330, largely driven by our investments in additional generation. Again, so we can make sure we're meeting our reliability requirements, PRM, and then also that we're continuing to invest for additional growth. T&D, we do see a small decrease. Again, that has to do more with our budgeting and how we captured our renewables over the course of time. But I can assure you that we've continued to invest additional dollars into our T&D system. Again, we talked about some of the investments in substations, transformers, system improvements, TDIP work. And then lastly, in terms of our general, you can see here that it's increased from 109 to 118 million. Again, that's largely associated with additional investments in AMI and the AMI ecosystem that we're continuing to bring forward, which Javier detailed out in terms of benefits. Next, I'm going to take us to how do we make sure we're able to, how do we finance this? So again, as we think about this, the rationale that we have for our debt issuances, here's what we've got from 22 through 25. Again, SD3 really lays out how we approach this, and the fact that we're looking to maintain the AA rating that really drives how we approach when we do our debt issuances, looking at effectively our cash on hand. And again, making sure that we're delivering on the strategic directive that the board's laid out for us. We focus with the agencies on maintaining our 2x debt service coverage. And when we go below that, we need to continue to increase and issue debt. We plan to end the end of the years with 200 days cash on hand and continue to focus on those elements that we've covered relative to the monitoring report. I will highlight here that we've been out in the market quite active in 2024. The blue highlights the amount that's been refunded. We've refunded those as savings for our customers, which is a great outcome. A lot of work's gone into that. We did the issuance in both June, and then we just wrapped up our pricing last week. So we'll have 2 completed. As we look forward to 2025, you can see here that we have net proceeds for new money that will be coming on to the tune of $406 million to finance our ongoing capital program. All right. Let's move on to our proposed rate action. This is a report that folks should be very familiar with. This is where we compare ourselves to the national average. You can see here how we've continued to increase our competitiveness over the course of time, going back to 2019 through 2024, again, going from 15.5 to 32.5%. Pretty amazing to see how we've continued to increase our competitiveness over the course of time. And again, as we think about it, we've had past couple of years a series of rate increases, but obviously less than would be otherwise when you compare ourselves to other utilities from a national perspective. And again, what I'd highlight is if we look at the area between the orange line and the blue line, that's again, money that gets put back, gets maintained within our customers' pockets and within the community. And again, that works out to roughly almost $400 million compared to what if they were to pay a national average rate. The last point I'd make is we continue to think we will be competitive even with the 6.3% increase again moving forward. We go on to the next slide.
Can we pause it quickly? It may be a good conversation with the board, because a question that may come is, if you go back to that slide, 2019, we were 15% below the national average. I know that's not the way the board asked us to measure against SE2, but just another measure. What happened between 2019 and 2024 that we became so much more competitive? 15.5% to 32.5% below the national average. And part of it is, of course, we've thrown a lot of things in there. It's the public power model. You talk about the growth, the investments we've made, but really the nation as a whole hasn't seen load growth to the extent we're seeing it right now in the past 5 years. Generally speaking, other than Vogtle Plant 3 and 4 and some other major plants, really, we haven't been in a construction expansion period in the sector for the past 5 years. That phenomenon really started about 2 years ago, and it will likely continue for the next few years. So really, what caused other utilities, our competitive landscape, to for their rates to grow faster, significantly faster than our rates? And part of it is operations. Right. It's as other utilities continue to operate the same system, we were trying to do the same thing. Remember, we came off the 2015, 2016 timeframe under a very clear cost and process improvement initiative. Try to lower costs, try to right size the organization, and so I think we've benefited from that. Those efforts, even though we have had rate increases in the past 3 years, they've been very modest, and I think part of it is the benefit that we got from all of that cost of process improvement initiative. The other piece has been the type of fuel that we've used. While other utilities were significantly more loaded on natural gas, we didn't see that big impact. We had natural gas peakers, but the effects of Winter Storm Uri, which is when you see that change in 2021 to 2022, see that huge change in competitiveness, I would attribute a lot of that was to inputs, to fuel costs that other utilities were incurring as they were operating the same system that they were operating before. And I say that because we've been conservative, we've been balanced. We are building more natural gas plants, so we will be more exposed to fuels, but not to the extent that I would say the national landscape was exposed to. The rate pressure that we're starting to see here at OPPD, the proposal that you have in front of you, has more to do with growth, with load growth, with serving additional load, and with strengthening our system by ways of increased plant reserve margins. So we're building stuff, we're adding more machines, we're adding more wires, we're cutting more trees. That's what's causing the rate increase. That is not exclusive to OPPD. I would say that that's going to happen, and it is already happening across the United States. So I think it's an important consideration to try to think about what has improved our competitiveness so far, and is this competitive edge, will it continue for the time being? I posit it will. Because I don't believe we're unique in this situation. I think there are other utilities maybe lagging behind us because they haven't really started building. They will soon. So as our rates go up, my assumption is everybody else's rates in the industry will go up to address growing load, aging infrastructure and decarbonization goals. I don't think those are gonna go away anytime soon, especially the aging infrastructure and the growing load. Those are two new forces that are really coming to us really hard.
How did we see a reduction in the kilowatt cost from 2023 to 2024 when we had a rate increase? I guess I don't.
Yeah.
I'm getting into the math. It gets dangerous, I realize.
It is an interesting one. This is just how the way the EIA calculates these is all your costs divided by all of your gigawatt hours. But yeah, you're right. Those are not reflective of our true rates. That's just an approximation. But Jeff.
No, I think you're right. And we do see that. We've explained that in the past in terms of good eye, because it does catch one's eye, but it literally relates to how what you've generated, what your sales are versus what your costs. And again, probably not, we'll get
I
that.
realize the year's not over, but that's what we got. Right?
Yeah. Javier, I'm going to continue on your trend where we talk about let's go to the next slide. What's our rate action versus the rest of the industry? And so what we've gone out is sampled local Nebraska utilities, major utilities, from a public perspective, plus neighboring states, plus investor-owned utilities. Again, when we look at the average, we didn't do the math and bake the math. It actually comes out to 6.3 with the ones that we sampled. That happens to be the rate increase that we're proposing as well. As we talk about what the drivers are across the board, again, it depends on where folks are at in their life cycle. We've talked about different utilities being earlier into the process, adding additional generation, different generation mixes. All of those factors come into play. And again, we've highlighted here on the side, I think you did a great job, Javier, of kind of highlighting specifically what different drivers are depending upon what's impacting the utility that's reporting these increases. But again, we feel that the increase, again, when we look at across the publics, not unreasonable in terms of where we're at within our journey in terms of adding additional resources. We're a little bit ahead compared to some of our others, and then compared to our investor-owned utilities, we continue to see a lower rate increase. Move on to the next slide.
You're going to see a comparison between us, obviously, and LES, but in particular, NPPD, and the 2% increases. That's just for the residential, right? And I realize NPPD is primarily wholesale, right?
It's just a retail rate.
This is just retail.
So I guess the logical public question might be is, wow, you're 6.3 in NPPD, you're best comparison around here, I guess, or someone can argue it's only 2%. Is that partly due to the conclusion could get drawn that, well, NPPD has nuclear? We don't. Is that an issue? That's going to probably come up, I would imagine. Or that would be a thought, I guess.
You know, I have a lot of respect for OPPD. They run a fantastic organization. And you're right, these only represents a portion of their customers. They sell wholesale power to other customers, and their other customers then add distribution costs, customer costs, ultimately resulting in the final cost a Nebraska family living in Western Nebraska experiences. That's not reflected in here. What I can tell you today, again, it's a fantastically well-run utility, just like ours. They have nuclear, we don't. They have made announcements. Their board approved earlier this year a budget that includes more generation. My understanding is that they are on a similar path as we are in terms of adding more generation, more transmission. They're growing too. Load growth is not exclusive to the urban area here in Omaha. It's happening everywhere. The type of growth they're seeing might be from different industries, but they're seeing the same load growth. My expectation is that they're going to start building things. They are too experiencing the same planned reserve margin requirements than we are, same as LES. So they're going to have to address not only their load growth, but also additional capacity they need to serve the same customers. I can't project exactly what they're going to do with their rates, but my expectation is that they're going to be building a lot more stuff in the years to come, and that may have additional rate pressure. That was the comment I was making earlier about our competitive position that I think this trend will continue for years to come in terms of building new generation to serve new customers. They too have aging assets, just like we do. At some point, they're going to have to address those too. So it's great to have that competition. It's a healthy competition between these three utilities. They all provide LES, and MPPD provide fantastic service to
I
their customers.
hate to call them a competitor. I guess it's just a natural comparison. People might draw us as from the same stuff.
Right.
Rather than be competitors.
And I think the answer is we're at different stages of evolution in our utilities. We're ahead of the curve in terms of constructing because our load came faster than theirs. But I think at some point they will too start to increase investments, which may cause them to increase costs.
Great. We'll move on to the next slide. So we wanted to provide, as it relates to the price per kilowatt hour, so more of an absolute cost versus the rate increase and what that means. So when we think about it, you know, the average bill, $117 per month. We see that going up by roughly $9 to $10 per month. And again, here you've got the information relative to our comparative public power within Nebraska, neighboring utilities in different states, and then also how we compare it to investor-owned utilities. So hopefully folks find that useful as we oftentimes will be compared against our neighbors and how they're performing. But we feel like we're very competitive where we stand today, especially with the amount of investment that we've got going on.
So what we see here is north, say the region name, Northwest Central region.
Got it?
Okay. And then secondly, the number we're seeing is not on any of our actual rates. This is the blended average from the EAA total revenue divided by total megawatt hours, gigawatt hours, right?
Right.
Just reaffirm that. I know we said it before and it was on the previous slide, but that number does not appear on any of our specific rates. We do have more for the future of percentages by class. And then the rate tables are provided attached to this later. Is that right?
They are. We've got the service regs attached, the COP book attached, as well as the individual rate class adjustments attached as well.
Just making sure and understanding what we are seeing here and what we are not seeing here, because this is not something that people will see on their bill or in the rate. This is something different.
Thank you, brother. One last comment I'll make, and I think it's important because I think it comes up every year. And it has to do with the composition of customers. How many, whether you have some utilities that are heavy residential customers versus some other utilities that are heavier industrial users. Generally speaking, and I'm going to speak in generalities here, but generally speaking, an industrial customer has a higher load factor, meaning they use the system in a more efficient way. These are factories that have 3 shifts, sometimes 4, that are running 24/7. They utilize the system in a much more efficient way. They usually don't have distribution costs. And so for every 100 megawatts of generation and transmission you build, they're using on average 95 of those year round the clock. That leads to a more efficient use of the system, which typically results in lower rates, kilowatt for kilowatt, than a residential customer. A residential customer is a less efficient user of power. The traditional family that gets up in the morning, uses the system really early as everyone is going to school and to work. And then for the rest of the day, you really don't use much energy until you come back in the evening. I say that because that helps explain a little bit of the discrepancy between these utilities, and that not all utilities serve the same type of customers. There are some utilities here on this graph that have a heavier concentration of industrial customers, while others have a heavier concentration of residential customers. Those with residential customers tend to have a higher rates per kilowatt hour than those that are heavy industrial customers. So again, and going back to your point, Jerry Williams, it's these numbers are imperfect. They're estimates from the EIA. They should not be necessarily construed to specific rates, but it gives you a good comparison of where are we on a competitive landscape compared to other utilities in the region.
So if I can follow on there, you mentioned larger customer rate classes, higher utilization. Do we have numbers, and I've heard others reference this, but only casually, never seen any citation. Do we have numbers on utilization across our system or utilization by rate class broadly? Okay, and that's not something I've ever really seen in any of our presentations, but perhaps that would be helpful for board information. I mean, like, what is the annual utilization across our entire utility?
Yeah, it's called a load factor, and we can follow up with some information on that, really to help understand how well are customers using the system versus how much margin we leave unused
Right.
during the day.
And the reason I ask is that I've heard reference to the idea that the utilization has been falling at utilities for years and decades, and that is leading to some of the price pressure that we are seeing, is that we end up with underutilized infrastructure that is not returning revenue to the utility, and that is somewhat of a challenge. So I guess I'll be interested to review that and see kind of what that trend is, or where we are now, and kind of if we have any older information about this, and what we might anticipate in the future as electrification continues. What do we project that might mean for utilization across the rate classes moving forward? If higher utilization customers are more cost efficient, both for them and for us, what does that mean for us strategically about what we are projecting in the future? So I know that's a real specific question. It is not related to any of these numbers here, but when you said utilization, I've been wondering about this for quite a while, and I think it has a lot to do with what we anticipate in the future.
We'll take that as an action item, and maybe we can work with the finance committee or systems committee to have a little deeper dive at some point in the
That
future.
sounds great. Thanks very much.
Question? All right, I'm going to keep us moving. Here we've got, next slide, this re-summarizes what we are bringing forward relative to the 2025 requested rate action, 6.3%. I think we've gone through the individual components. I'm going to keep us moving forward. We can get down to the costs. Next, we'll talk about cost to serve OPPD customers. Javier did a great job talking about this in terms of how different customers utilize the system. There's certain investments which are allocated to all customers. We talked about energy generation, demand, transmission costs, and then some of those that are more specific to smaller and commercial customers, distribution costs and customer costs. And again, we've got different elements of the investments that are going on in those areas broken out underneath. Again, I think you did a nice job highlighting how different customers utilize the system, Javier. Next, let's move on to the 2025 rate changes. So again, Mike, as we talked about, how does this impact everyone? So 6.3% is the total over on the left-hand side. Again, we see that broken out between residential, commercial, industrial, lighting, and wholesale. What I would highlight just as a couple of spots as we go through this again, this is going through the cost of service. Again, utilized as a best practice within the utility industry, making sure that we've got fair, non-discriminatory practices, and we're practicing cost causation. This is in detail in terms of the service regulations, Director Williams. So you can find that again in the board book, as well as we have Brad will go through and specifically do an independent evaluation. They look at the costs that are deriving and driving the COP budget, and then specifically how those are being allocated from a cost of service perspective. The FP&A team spends a lot of time with them working through that, making sure that they understand what the cost drivers are, and then ultimately how costs are being allocated. What we do see here in terms of residential sees a larger increase, and we think about that in terms of from a cost of service perspective. Focus on vegetation management. The increased investment we've got there really impacts more so on the distribution side. Higher allocation to residential because they were the ones that would be benefiting from that. Outage management system, field management system, again, are some of the larger drivers in terms of what would be driving some additional costs over to the residential side versus the average of 6.3. As we look at commercial and industrial.
And really quick, even these breakdown, even these ones are averages, right? There's within each category, and you'll see these on the red line of the rate manual, will have specific rate changes for rate 110, 115, etc. This is just the average for that residential rate, the average for all the commercial rates and industrial rates. I'm stating the obvious here, but I think it's important to going back to the same estimation. We're presenting these in still in some aggregate form, the specific rate changes are in your books.
When we look over to a commercial industrial, we do see a little bit lower increase compared to the average 6.3. Again, as we talked about it, they're using the system a little bit more efficiently. And I think an important point as we look at this, when we think about the industrial and commercial class, again, lower from a price increase perspective, but when you look at the amount of volume that they're adding to the system, they're paying more than the residential classes in terms of when you think about total revenues, retail revenue. And so important piece as we think about how that impacts ultimately retail revenues and the bottom line for the enterprise.
It's devil's advocate. Someone might argue the fact that it's our data centers who obviously are in the industrial class there are at least partially responsible for a rate increase. And we're seeing, obviously in this regards here, some can draw the conclusion the residential customer is picking up the unfair part of that, where the real culprit is the industrial class. I mean, that's a conclusion some people would make.
Right. Well, I think that's an important part of cost of service, right? So you only pay for what you use of the system. And so when we go out and we allocate out costs, it's based upon what is needed to serve those customers based upon their usage characteristics.
We get the public to understand that.
Yeah. Good point.
So, I mean, you mentioned the cost of service, and 2-3 years ago, we did a relatively elaborate cost of service study presentation to board members, and perhaps that's something we would want to ask for again next year to help us keep up to date on this type of allocation. And we'll have a new board member, I think would benefit from that as well. But it's been a couple of years. I think there have been some changes that I think would be helpful. And again, I don't mean to pressure us into additional meetings, but this is something that we did talk about in great length, and but it's been a few years.
Yeah. 2.5 years ago, we did that. Yeah. Be happy to do that again.
I think that would be helpful, at least for me, and I'll let others decide if they would like to
These
participate.
changes moved us pretty close to where they should be in each of the classes. We still have one class that's still. With these changes in effect, with these rate changes, if it passes in the way it's proposed, will the classes all be basically where they should be? Or is there still need for?
Yeah, I think as you look at a cost of service, there are elements of gradualism that come into play in terms of how costs are allocated over the course of time. But again, this gets us directionally where we need to be relative to the costs that are allocated across the classes. So yes.
Okay.
And
Mike, are you anticipating that at some point we would have a rate increase of, let's say, 2 or 3%, and it would be the same across all classes? Is that what?
No, I'm not saying that because I realize the different classes have different characteristics. And
Yeah.
I understand that part. They've never been that way. And, no, I'm just saying is I can see the criticism of the folks when they're going to see the industrial rate increase being less than the residential, when a lot of people are of the mentality now that the data centers are the culprit to an extent, I guess. It's gonna come up.
Right.
the other piece,
I'm trying to understand the question, so thank you.
I'm gonna beat a dead horse here for a second. Again, as we think about the 6.3, that is what's gonna impact people's families' budgets, things from that perspective. But again, I would highlight that of the 6.3, 1.4 of that is associated with 2024 costs. And that doesn't give anyone a reprieve in terms of how that, again, impacts them and their family's budget. But I think it's an important piece as we're trying to think about what we're bringing forward is the enterprise. Really the 4.9 is the general increase that would adjust these. Or I think they're good to keep, that's good to keep in perspective as we're looking at the overall ask for the board. Lastly, I guess 2 last slides. We'll keep it going. So here's some additional rate changes that have gone through. I won't plan to go through these in great detail unless there's additional questions. As we've talked about moving from tariffs to products, there's been some movements. Again, as we think about the riders that have been adjusted here, those offerings largely will still be in place, but not a ton to highlight here. Just want to make sure, and again, that's in the service regs if folks are interested. And then lastly, as it relates to the board consultant. I've talked about that on this next slide in terms of the cost of service, what it means. Again, hired on behalf of the board, again, to look at specifically how we are allocating costs as an independent entity. We spend a lot of time with them. Best practice, again, we're happy that the board is facilitating that, and we work in good partnership with Brattle. And there's the additional Brattle report that's within the deck, so you can look to see what their comments were on our cost of service. Questions?
What, Matt?
One second here. I guess the load, I'd be maybe interested to see the load factor that you guys talked about before voting on this. I have some questions with, I guess the subjectivity versus objectivity of a large user and what that cost comes into be. And I think that would be helpful to me to be more comfortable with this. I don't know how big of an ask that is, so if that's something we can see before a vote.
We can certainly show that. I think at an aggregate basis, from an assumption perspective, we can share that each customer will have different ones, but ultimately we use that data to aggregate it into a customer class. And we can share that with you. I think probably the biggest differentiator, so even though I did talk a lot about load factor, the biggest differentiator between an industrial customer versus a commercial or residential customer is, you can see that on one of the previous slides. I think it's this slide here, like 3 slides before. If you can go back to that one. There. That's the biggest issue, right? An industrial customer, generally speaking, doesn't have any distribution costs or customer costs. These are big factories or a data center that locates their facility right outside of a substation. So the cost that we incur to serve that customer is the generation cost and the high voltage transmission substation, period. There are no distribution poles, no transformer poles, very little customer costs, the billing, the printing, all of that. There is some of that goes to them, but the bulk of distribution and customer costs are not allocated to industrial customers because of the nature of how we serve them, how they're located, how they take service. That is probably the biggest explanation of why an industrial customer carries a lower costs than commercial and residential costs, at least for OPPD. A commercial customer, a grocery store, a hospital, and then a residential customer or any household would have additional costs that are really associated with distributing that power that comes from the substation all the way out to the house. And then the customer service that comes along that takes, it's more costly to maintain that. I would say that's probably the biggest explanation of the differential. And on top of that, then you have the higher load factor versus low load factor for customers. Happy to share that with you. We can facilitate that before the next board meeting.
I can appreciate all that, but if not for the amount of energy they need, we wouldn't have to have some things, right? So that's the part where I want to be comfortable with the larger increase for the residential folks, because I think you would say a more densely populated area is less expensive to energize than folks that I typically represent in rural area, right? However, there's burdens that they bear disproportionately as well. So I'm just trying to bring this all together to understand
Right. So
where we can impact change in that approach, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure, we can do that, and we've had this conversation in different flavors during the past few years. We have to follow a certain models, certain procedures, right? There's a limit to how much we can allocate, and there's not a lot of discretion. When you have energy generation costs, of course, large industrial customers take a lot of power. We make sure that a proportional part of the energy generation cost is passed on to those large customers based on the amount of power they take. Same with transmission, demand generation costs. It has to be proportional too. With some imprecision, because you have, you're aggregating things. You just mentioned residential customers who live in rural areas versus a residential customer who lives in an urban area. We really don't have a way to differentiate between those two. It's the same house. We have to serve them the same way, but one costs a lot more because you have less density. The same transmission line, the same crew that goes out and installs and maintains for 2 or 3 households versus one that knock out thousands of households in the same distance. So there's always that imprecision that may occur within the same customer class. But between customer classes, we have to be very careful about how we allocate. But I think we can benefit from having a little deeper dive maybe between now and the next board meeting, just to make you more comfortable about the rationale, the process that we go through in differentiating and allocating costs. Happy to do that. That ultimately, that's what the Brattle Group does in a way for you. So we'll do that for you too. But you please know that the board has a rate consultant that reviews our methodologies, our cost of service models, et cetera. And you can rely on them on the letter they provide you, or maybe have them be a resource for you to ask those additional questions, not only just of our staff, but of your rate consultant. And I love that inquiry, because I think it's important, right, to have that transparency and due diligence, make sure that we're doing the right thing and that we're allocating costs in the right way.
And Brattle can be totally independent. They don't have a dog in the hunt. They can.
Well, no,
Totally objective.
they are hired to be the independent rate consultant for the board.
Yeah, man. Caution on this one. The cost of service study presentation was that 4-hour presentation. So if you've got some time in your schedule, I'm sure between now and December, someone on staff can help you with that. But it is one of the more intense things that I think any of us have maybe ever done while we were here. It is a lot of information. And I'm not suggesting that you don't seek that out, but I guess I'm just giving you a heads up that if you're looking for that level of clarity, it can be provided in.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
We'll bring cookies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
And yeah, just a heads up where that discussion goes.
Any other questions or perplexities that need to be listed?
I'm crockpot thinking on it a little bit, so I don't have any now, but I guess which has me curious about, so action in December. So between now and then, if we've got questions, we need more information. I want to make sure I understand what the right avenue is by which we're gonna do that.
Well, since it's a finance committee item,
Sure.
I would say just to keep the structure.
Yep.
I think I would say we'll work with Mary and Jeff. If you have any questions, we can try to address questions by different means, either by responding to specific requests, either in writing, or we can invite you in and we can have sessions where we can dive a little deeper. It all depends on your appetite for additional.
So which tells me the sooner we get questions in front of the team, the better, so that we can some runway to get those answered. Okay.
And why December is important, because we need this authorization for us to legally begin expending resources January 1st.
This is the usual time pattern we use.
That's what we always do.
Yeah. And Matt, I know I was a little bit on tangent there earlier in my question about utilization, but the variance between rate classes is why I'm so interested in how do we understand the utilization in those rate classes and what does that imply for the cost of service study inputs? And I believe that there will be more opportunity for more flexibility and more utilization from the presidential class in the future that might lead to, with some policy work and some collaboration, might lead to some potentially beneficial outcomes there. In the way that residential customers currently aren't, especially, well, I think there's more flexibility there than we have seen in the past. And we have started to move in that direction with our demand management program. But I think there's a lot more opportunity there so that in the future, higher utilization in the residential sector can help to avoid additional increasing costs relative to the other sectors.
This is what AMI brings us.
Sure.
Right? the more granularity into the each customer's utilization, not only just the total consumption of kilowatt hours, but the demand of kilowatts that happen and how we allocate this cost. I think
That'd be awesome. We get that. That'd be great.
Well, and I appreciate the efforts for, I think we talked last year around this time about ensuring that folks that might be residential high users of the right rate class, so they don't get disproportionately charged because maybe they're an operation further than, my home. If I recall that right, there was some work you guys did to ensure that was the case when we made the change last time.
There is that, and then there's also the added information, just a lot more specific information about the same house. You can have two houses side by side. One has two air conditioning units, one has. Well, the demand on the system from one is very different than the other. Right now, we don't have a way to differentiate between those two, so the fixed charge for both is the same, and they pay the same volumetric charge. In a future environment, we'll have a way to differentiate and say, well, your demand is higher, then your demand charge should be higher than your neighbor. I think it's going in that direction, which will have add more clarity. Still imperfect, but a lot better than it is today. Sure.
I think it'll give the utility that line of sight, but it also gives the customer line of sight to when they're using what they're using and preemptively plan their bill.
Any other comments? Questions?
So, I'm sorry, one more question. We have talked about the rate design update, and we are not seeing substantial changes in rate structures associated with the corporate operating plan, this rate action, right?
That's correct.
And, but we do anticipate later in the year that some of that will go into effect.
Yeah, we're anticipating doing a mid-year review and then ultimately bringing it out some additional adjustments to the board for consideration, which I think we'd be looking for October for action on that.
You think?
I think one
Decline block.
Right, to just specifically talk about these are the declining block rates that we've discussed in the past many times. The proposal in front of you still has those declining block rates. The difference in rates between each one of those blocks has shrunk dramatically. So there's a lot less difference between the three blocks of non-summer usage for residential customers. But there's still blocks. And I think what Director Williams was alluding to is sometime in the middle of next year, we'll come back to the board for a separate rate action that will eventually now just eliminate those blocks and have a flat rate and have a summer and summer rate without the decline. So that would be the expected progression.
And as of now, there will strictly be a change in the structure, not additional.
Right now, it's just a change in the rate,
Oh, right.
not
Just
the
so everybody's
structure. So there's still the same blocks, same way we measure them, but just the rate we charge for each block is different. It's a lot more compact between one block and the next.
Let me just so it's always clear, that would not be an additional likely increase in rates at all, strictly an adjustment in how the rates are determined. Correct?
Correct. Total
Yeah,
revenue,
that's fine.
but I think going back to Director Buckner's point earlier, is it will help users,
I got that
customers
part.
know
I
how
got that
to
part. So make
best
sure
use
people, it's clear that that's not, there would be there's no likelihood of a secondary rate increase in the middle of the year. Net increase.
net increase. You will have some users who are large users who may be benefiting from a slightly lower block, right? And then on summer months where they may experience an adjustment. But the point I'm trying to make is it's going to be a much smaller adjustment because there's really not that much difference between those blocks anyway. Right? But it has been a labor of love over years and years to get us there and finally eliminate that, as Director Mulholland may remember.
You'll remember as part of the rate design project, we contemplated doing some of those now, or do we do those later and separate it from the rate action? And that was the recommendation. We talked to Brown about that as well, just so there's no confusion. Thank you.
Back to